The tour bus was cutting through the black English motorway somewhere between Birmingham and London in the autumn of 1981, and most of the crew had already passed out from a long night of whiskey and amphetamines, when the argument that had been simmering for 3 days finally exploded between two men who would become the most dangerous figures in heavy metal history. Lemmy Kilmister, the bass-playing, speed-fueled frontman of Motorhead, and Ozzy Osbourne, the recently fired and deeply unstable former voice of Black Sabbath, had been sharing this cramped touring vehicle for nearly 2 weeks, and what started as a disagreement over a bottle of Jack Daniels quickly escalated into something far more violent than anyone on that bus expected. The driver, a seasoned roadie who had seen every kind of rock and roll chaos imaginable, would later say that he had never in his life pulled a vehicle over so fast, because he genuinely believed one of them was going to kill the other. But the strangest part of this story is not the blood, not the broken glass, and not the fact that both men had to be physically separated by 3 grown men each. The strangest part is what happened the very next night, when Lemmy and Ozzy sat side by side at a pub in North London, drinking in complete silence, as if nothing had ever happened, and what Ozzy quietly slid across the bar counter toward Lemmy would seal a brotherhood that lasted until the day Lemmy took his final breath in December of 2015. To understand how two of the most volatile personalities in rock history nearly destroyed each other on a freezing English highway, and why that night ultimately made them inseparable, you have to go back to where it all began, to a time when neither of them had anything to lose and everything to prove. If you are the kind of person who lives for these untold rock and roll stories, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell, because what comes next in this story is something most people have never heard before. By 1981, Lemmy Kilmister had already survived more near-death experiences than most people could imagine in 10 lifetimes. He had been kicked out of Hawkwind 6 years earlier after being arrested at the Canadian border with amphetamines, and that betrayal had fueled the creation of Motorhead, a band so loud and so fast that critics did not even know what genre to call it. Lemmy had spent those years living on a diet of Jack Daniels and Coca-Cola, Marlboro cigarettes, and enough speed to kill a horse. His face was carved with deep lines, his voice was a raspy growl, and his Rickenbacker bass sounded like a chainsaw cutting through sheet metal. By the time Motorhead released Ace of Spades in 1980, they had become the bridge between punk rock and heavy metal, and Lemmy was their undisputed king, a man who lived exactly the way he played, fast, hard, and without apology. Ozzy Osbourne, on the other hand, was in the darkest period of his entire life in 1981. Black Sabbath had fired him 2 years earlier, and the dismissal had shattered him in ways that most people never fully understood. He had been the voice of the band that essentially invented heavy metal, and being told he was no longer wanted was like being told his entire identity was a lie. He had spiraled into a haze of alcohol and drugs so severe that Sharon Arden, the woman who would eventually become his wife, found him passed out in his own vomit on multiple occasions. But Sharon saw something in Ozzy that nobody else could see, and she was rebuilding him from the ground up, launching his solo career with Blizzard of Oz. The problem was that Ozzy was still fragile, still volatile, and still deeply insecure about whether the world would accept him without the Black Sabbath name behind him. The circumstances that put Lemmy and Ozzy on the same tour bus in the autumn of 1981 were born out of pure economics and the chaotic scheduling of the British heavy metal circuit. Both bands were playing a string of dates across England, and their management teams had worked out a cost-sharing arrangement for transportation. It seemed like a perfectly reasonable idea on paper. Two of the biggest names in heavy metal, traveling together, splitting costs. What nobody accounted for was that putting Lemmy Kilmister and Ozzy Osbourne in a confined space for extended periods was like locking two territorial wolves in the same cage and expecting them to share a meal peacefully. The first few days were actually fine, and by most accounts, the two men got along well enough in the beginning. They had known each other casually for years through the interconnected web of British heavy metal, and there was a mutual respect between them that came from recognizing a kindred spirit. Both men were outsiders, both had been betrayed by people they trusted, and both dealt with their pain by consuming substances that would have killed ordinary human beings. Lemmy would sit in the back of the bus with his bottle of Jack Daniels, playing solitaire or reading a war history book, and Ozzy would sprawl across the seats near the front, nursing whatever combination of alcohol and pills he had acquired that day. The crew members moved between them like diplomats navigating a demilitarized zone, but underneath that fragile calm, something was building. Lemmy had a way of saying exactly what he thought with zero filter, and Ozzy had a way of taking everything personally, especially when he was drinking. It was only a matter of time before those two qualities collided. The trouble began 3 days before the actual fight, and it started with something so trivial that it would be almost comical if it had not led to such violent consequences. Lemmy had brought a specific bottle of Jack Daniels onto the bus, one that he had been saving from a particular stop, and when he reached for it one evening, he discovered that it was nearly empty. Ozzy, who had been drinking heavily all day, did not even try to deny that he had helped himself to it, and his casual attitude about the whole thing was the first spark that lit the fuse. For most people, a missing bottle of whiskey would be a minor annoyance, but for Lemmy, it was a matter of principle. He had survived the streets, he had survived prison cells, he had survived betrayal by his own bandmates, and through all of it, he maintained a personal code that was rigid as iron. You did not take another man's drink without asking. You did not disrespect another man's space. What made the situation worse was that Ozzy, in his intoxicated state, made a comment that cut deeper than he probably intended. He made a remark about Motorhead's commercial performance compared to his own solo success, something along the lines of suggesting that Lemmy could afford to share since Motorhead was not exactly selling out arenas on their own. It was the kind of offhand, drunken comment that Ozzy probably forgot 5 minutes after he said it, but Lemmy heard every word, and every word landed like a punch. Lemmy had spent his entire career being told that Motorhead was too loud, too fast, too ugly, too everything for mainstream success, and he wore that rejection as a point of pride. But hearing it from someone he considered a peer, someone who should have understood what it meant to be an outsider, that was different. That was personal. The crew noticed that Lemmy went quiet after that, and anyone who knew Lemmy understood that a quiet Lemmy was far more dangerous than a loud one. Over the next 3 days, the atmosphere on that tour bus became so thick with tension that crew members started finding excuses to ride in the equipment truck instead. Lemmy barely spoke to anyone, sitting in his corner with his war books and his cards, drinking from a new bottle that he kept physically closer to his body than his own bass guitar. Ozzy, who was either oblivious to the damage he had done or too proud to acknowledge it, continued drinking and talking loudly, telling stories about the Black Sabbath days and his new solo material with the kind of manic energy that came from mixing alcohol with whatever pills he was taking at the time. Every time Ozzy's voice rose above a certain volume, the crew members would exchange nervous glances, because they could see Lemmy's jaw tightening, they could see the veins in his neck standing out just a little bit more, and they could feel the temperature dropping every time Ozzy mentioned anything about chart positions or record sales. The second incident happened on the second day, when Ozzy allegedly made another comment, this time about Lemmy's appearance. The exact words have been disputed over the years, but multiple people who were on that bus have confirmed that Ozzy said something about the famous warts on Lemmy's face, something that was meant as a joke but landed as an insult. Lemmy did not respond verbally. He simply looked at Ozzy with an expression that one roadie later described as the look of a man who has already decided exactly how and when he is going to hurt you, but is choosing to wait for the right moment. That look should have been a warning to everyone on the bus, But Ozzy was too far gone into his own chemical haze to read the room, and the people around them were too afraid of both men to intervene directly. By the third day, the bus felt like a pressure cooker with a broken valve, and everybody except Ozzy seemed to know that it was about to blow. It was somewhere past midnight on that third night, on a dark stretch of motorway between Birmingham and London, when everything finally came apart. The exact trigger has been told differently by different people who were there, but the most consistent account suggests that Ozzy, who was extremely drunk and possibly on downers, stumbled toward the back of the bus and accidentally knocked over Lemmy's card game, scattering cards across the floor and spilling what remained of his drink. Some accounts say Ozzy also stepped on one of Lemmy's prized war history books, though that detail has never been confirmed by Lemmy himself. What happened next, however, is something that every person on that bus agrees on. Lemmy stood up with a speed that seemed impossible for a man who had been drinking for 12 hours straight, grabbed Ozzy by the front of his shirt, and slammed him against the wall of the bus with enough force to crack the thin paneling behind Ozzy's back. The sound was loud enough to wake everyone who had been sleeping, and within seconds, the narrow aisle of the tour bus became a battlefield. Ozzy, despite being smaller and more intoxicated, was not the kind of man who went down without a fight. He had grown up in the streets of Birmingham. He had been in countless brawls before he ever picked up a microphone, and his survival instincts kicked in immediately. He swung back at Lemmy with a wild haymaker that caught Lemmy somewhere around the ear, and from that point on, the two men were locked together in a violent struggle that sent equipment, bottles, and crew members flying in every direction. The bus was swaying dangerously on the motorway as the driver tried to maintain control, while two of heavy metal's most iconic figures tried to tear each other apart just a few feet behind him. A roadie named Doug, who weighed over 200 pounds, tried to get between them and took an elbow to the face for his trouble. Another crew member grabbed Lemmy from behind and was dragged forward as Lemmy lunged at Ozzy again, knocking over an amplifier that crashed against the window with a sound like a gunshot. The driver, who had been doing this job for nearly a decade and had transported everyone from Led Zeppelin's road crew to the Sex Pistols, later said that this was the only time he ever genuinely feared for someone's life on his bus. He pulled over onto the hard shoulder with the kind of urgency that sent unsecured items sliding forward and people grabbing for anything bolted down. When the bus finally stopped, it took 5 men to pull Lemmy and Ozzy apart, 3 on Lemmy and 2 on Ozzy, and even then Lemmy was still straining forward, his knuckles scraped, his eyes locked on Ozzy with an intensity that made grown men step back. Ozzy had a split lip and a bruise forming under his left eye. The cold November air rushed in when someone opened the door, and for a long moment nobody moved. The two men stood on opposite sides of the bus, chests heaving, blood on their hands, surrounded by the wreckage of broken bottles and scattered belongings. What happened during the next hour has become one of rock and roll's most fascinating untold chapters. The crew separated the two men, with Lemmy sitting on the steps of the bus smoking a cigarette and staring into the darkness, and Ozzy sitting on the grass embankment about 50 feet away, his head in his hands. Neither man spoke. The crew quietly cleaned up the mess inside the bus, sweeping broken glass and righting overturned equipment. The tour manager made frantic phone calls from a roadside payphone, trying to arrange alternative transportation because nobody believed they could ride together for another minute. But before any arrangements could be made, something unexpected happened. Ozzy stood up from the embankment, walked slowly back toward the bus, and sat down on the step next to Lemmy without saying a word. Lemmy glanced at him, then looked away. They sat there in silence for about 10 minutes, and then Ozzy reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a crumpled pack of cigarettes, and offered one to Lemmy. Lemmy took it. No apology, no discussion, no explanation. Just two battered men sharing a cigarette on the side of a dark English highway while the rest of the world slept. The pub and the unspoken pact. The very next night, After both bands had played their respective shows at a London venue, Lemmy and Ozzy ended up at a pub in North London that was a well-known gathering spot for musicians and roadies in that era. The crew members who witnessed it said it was one of the strangest things they had ever seen. The two men who had been trying to destroy each other less than 24 hours earlier walked into the pub separately, spotted each other across the room, and without any visible hesitation, sat down at the bar side by side. They ordered their drinks, Lemmy his eternal Jack Daniels and Coke, Ozzy a pint of lager, and they drank in a silence that was somehow completely different from the hostile silence of the previous 3 days. This silence was comfortable. This silence was the silence of two men who had seen each other at their absolute worst and decided that it did not matter. And then, according to the most consistent version of this story, Ozzy reached into his coat pocket and slid something across the bar counter toward Lemmy. It was a small brass lighter engraved with a skull and crossbones, and those who saw it said it looked old, like something Ozzy had been carrying for years. No words accompanied the gesture. Lemmy picked it up, examined it, flicked it once to test the flame, and slipped it into his own pocket. Then he ordered another round for both of them. The crew members who witnessed this exchange understood instantly what they were seeing. This was not a peace offering in the traditional sense. This was something deeper and more primal, a recognition between two men that they had tested each other, found each other worthy, and sealed a bond that went beyond friendship into something that neither of them would ever be able to fully articulate. In the world of Lemmy Kilmister and Ozzy Osbourne, words were cheap and unreliable. Violence was honest. And what came after the violence, that quiet acknowledgement of mutual respect, was the most sacred thing of all. A brotherhood forged in blood. From that night forward, the relationship between Lemmy and Ozzy transformed into one of the most enduring friendships in the history of heavy metal. They were never the kind of friends who called each other every week or sent birthday cards. They were something more fundamental, men who had shed blood together and found in each other something that the rest of the world could never give them, an understanding that required no explanation. Ozzy would later feature Lemmy on his television show The Osbournes, and the footage revealed a side of both men that their public personas rarely allowed. Lemmy sitting on the Osbourne family couch, drinking Jack Daniels while Sharon fussed over him, Ozzy showing him some ridiculous new gadget with the enthusiasm of a child. It was domestic, it was mundane, and it was beautiful precisely because of how unexpected it was from two men the media had spent decades portraying as dangerous and self-destructive. Over the years, Lemmy and Ozzy would collaborate musically and appear together at festivals, but the real texture of their friendship existed in the moments that cameras rarely captured. They would sit together backstage in comfortable silence, sometimes for an hour or more, drinking and watching the chaos of the rock and roll circus swirl around them. Ozzy understood something about Lemmy that most people never grasped, that beneath the iron cross necklaces and the bullet belt, there was a man who was profoundly lonely. Lemmy had famously claimed to have slept with over 1,000 women, but the sheer volume of those encounters only highlighted the absence of genuine intimacy in his life. Ozzy, who had Sharon, who had children, who had a messy but real family life, saw this emptiness in Lemmy and quietly tried to fill some small part of it. When Motorhead played shows in Lowe's Angels, Lemmy had a standing invitation to the Osbourne house, and he used it regularly, becoming something like a beloved and slightly dangerous uncle to the Osbourne children. As the years passed and both men entered their 60s, the physical toll of their lifestyles became impossible to ignore. Lemmy, who had been consuming Jack Daniels and amphetamines for over 4 decades, was diagnosed with diabetes, and his doctors delivered the grim news that his body was so saturated with toxins that conventional treatment was complicated. The famous story about his blood being too poisoned for a clean transfusion became legendary among fans, and while the medical accuracy of that claim has been debated, it speaks to a fundamental truth about the way Lemmy lived. He did not moderate, he did not compromise, and when his body finally started to rebel, He switched from Jack Daniels to vodka and orange juice on his doctor's recommendation, and kept playing shows even as his body visibly deteriorated in front of audiences who loved him too much to look away. Ozzy watched all of this with a growing sense of dread that he rarely expressed publicly. He had managed, through Sharon's relentless intervention and his own fitful attempts at sobriety, to survive his own demons long enough to enter old age with some semblance of health. Seeing Lemmy decline was like watching a mirror image of what could have been. The man who had once been thrown against the wall of a tour bus by those powerful hands was now watching those same hands tremble while trying to hold a bass guitar. Motorhead's final tour were an exercise in pure willpower, with Lemmy performing through pain and exhaustion that would have hospitalized most people, and the audiences who came to see him understood that they were witnessing something that would not last much longer. The end came with a brutality that shocked even those who had been expecting it. On December 24, 2015, Lemmy celebrated his 70th birthday at his favorite bar, the Rainbow Bar and Grill on the Sunset Strip in Los Angeles, the same place where he had been drinking and playing video poker for decades. He looked frail but defiant, a skeleton wrapped in leather and silver, his famous mutton chops now white, his eyes still burning with fierce intelligence. 2 days later, he received the diagnosis that would seal his fate: aggressive cancer, inoperable, terminal. 4 days after his birthday, on December 28th, Lemmy Kilmister died at his home in Los Angeles, surrounded by a few close friends and the artifacts of a life lived entirely on his own terms. Ozzy Osbourne was among the first to speak publicly about Lemmy's death, and for a man known for his incoherent mumbling and comedic persona, what he said carried a weight that silenced everyone who heard it. He spoke about Lemmy with a tenderness that seemed impossible coming from the Prince of Darkness, calling him one of the most honest people he had ever known. And somewhere in those words, you could hear the echo of that autumn night in 1981. 2 men bleeding on a tour bus, the cold English air, a shared cigarette on the hard shoulder, and a brass lighter sliding across a bar counter without a single word to explain it. That was the language Lemmy and Ozzy spoke, a language older than rock and roll, older than music itself, the language of men who have looked into each other's eyes at the worst possible moment and found something worth keeping. Lemmy Kilmister did not leave behind a family in the traditional sense. He left behind a legacy that was louder, messier, and more honest than any family portrait could capture. And in the bond he shared with Ozzy Osbourne, he left behind proof that even the hardest men in the world are capable of a loyalty so deep that it can only be forged in blood.